Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Last week I spoke a bit about practice of samadhi and jhana. So this week I'd like to look at the other side of meditation practice and talk about the development of wisdom, the practice of vipassana, or more broadly, the arousing of wisdom. Wisdom, panya, is defined as seeing according to reality and not otherwise. So seeing things in their true nature. Vipassana is clear seeing, and it really should be thought of as a state or attitude of mind, a way of holding the mind, rather than as a specific practice. There are numerous particular techniques for developing vipassana. Most of the ones that are well known were developed in Burma. We have the Mahasi method, which is also called the noting method, which is the one I'm most familiar with, which is based on making a brief subliminal mental note on characterizing the objects, with the idea that this develops a rigor, a discipline, a precision in the noticing. There's a Goenka method, which is primarily based on body scanning and noticing sensations in the body. And now there's, in the West, some inroads being made by the method taught by Pa Ak, which is quite complex but has a basis in the four elements, noticing the four elements. But the pure essence, I would say, of vipassana, of holding the mind in that way, is to be present with the current moment object of consciousness, and to notice it clearly, purely, penetratingly. So there's a twofold skill or a knack to be developed. One is not to miss anything, and equally important, it has to be balanced with not holding on to anything. So a really good rule of thumb to remember is nothing is so trivial it can be ignored, and nothing is so important it needs to be held. One of Mahasi Sayadaw's metaphors for the mind with strong insight is like you're sitting in your car at a railway crossing watching a long train go by, and you notice each car in the train, and you're able to recognize, this is a boxcar, this is a tanker, this is a flatbed. But you don't get out of your car and follow the train down the tracks, and you don't give any particular exception to any carriage. They're all treated the same. Another analogy that I've used is, it's like at the county fair when they have this game where you're shooting wooden ducks with an air pistol, and it says that the wooden ducks go by, you pop each one down. So each object of consciousness is seen with this penetrating eye of insight. we're talking about a kind of the ideal to strive for. The mind should be imperturbably calm. It's not upset by anything that arises, whether it's celestial visions or an itchy bum. It's all it's all treated the same, and none of it has any significance. And they all have the same impact on the mind. It's just this is an object of consciousness. It's characterized as a mental formation or as a feeling or as a sense impression, however it may be. So this equanimity is a very important quality to have in the mind. To attain some semblance of this state, the mind must be equanimous. And there is a particular type of equanimity that's specifically mentioned, and it's from the Abhidhamma. It's a tatra majjhatthata. Is the kind of equanimity that's required to do insight properly. And it's been translated by Bhikkhu Bodhi. I think he was the one who coined the translation. It's used widely as specific neutrality, which is quite good. It's a good translation because it has those two aspects of specificity and neutrality. A literal breakdown of the roots of the word would have it being in the middle about that. The tatra part is that, and it's a reflexive pronoun that's specific, that's pointing to not just in a general direction, but that thing there, tatra. And majja is middle, as in Majjhima Nikaya, middle-length discourses. And atta is just a suffix that makes a noun out of a phrase. Sort of like the English ness. So tatra majjhatthata is the state of being in the middle about that. And that is the present moment object of consciousness. And just as there should be no exceptions to that, to whatever is the object, if you're trying to do this and you do find the mind reacting, then the reaction itself is the new object. So if you perceive a formation of internal or external that, for example, arouses fear, then in the next moment fear should be the correct object. If it starts a chain of thought, then thinking is the object. But if the objects are noticed with that precision at the moment of arising, they don't tend to persist because you're not feeding them any energy. So this is quite different from what we spoke about last week with samadhi, where the skill to be developed is the skill of non-attention, of not noticing distractions. With vipassana done properly, there are no distractions. There's just a range of objects. Every object is correctly seen and known. And what should occur, if this is done with diligence over time, is that the objects being noticed in their particular characteristics paradoxically begins to yield the realization of their universal characteristics. There's a multitude of objects that can be seen by the mind, an infinite number, really, in any of the sense bases. The universal characteristics of the objects need to be or should become more evident, and it's not something that you create with the mind, that you thinking about the theory and impose it, but they just become evident. And these are the three characteristics of emptiness or not self, dukkha or suffering or imperfection, and anicca, impermanence. And every object without exception is seen to have this nature. And this applies to thought formations, to feelings, to bodily sensations, to sense impressions, the whole gamut. When they're seen in their own true nature in this kind of momentary way, then there's no room for a self. There's just an object and a mind arising to the object. It's an impersonal process. Likewise, they're seen to be impermanent because they flicker so quickly in and out of existence. And they're dukkha in that they're imperfect and unsatisfying to the mind. They have a kind of provisional, partial, incomplete nature. And as these characteristics are more and more realized or penetrated by the mind, the spell of samsara begins to weaken. This is the process of nibbida, which is followed by vimutti and nirodha. Nibbida is the really difficult one to translate. I think the best approach is something like disenchantment or disillusion, that the spell of samsara is waning, it's fading. Because of the multitude of the objects, the ordinary mind is caught in this kind of maelstrom of phenomena, and it's kind of buffeted around. And it's the twin poles of attachment and aversion, or we could say fascination and fear, that keep the mind spinning around. But when the characteristics are seen, then it takes away the ground for fascination or fear. It can be likened to a kaleidoscope. You have this children's toy that's like a little telescope that you twist at the end, and you see all these pretty mandala-like designs, and there's a vast number, an array of them. But if you open up a kaleidoscope and examine how it's made, it's just some mirrors and a few shards of colored glass that float around in the circular end and were reflected in patterns in the mirror. So samsara is really just this endless kaleidoscope of fascinating and terrifying phenomena that when you get under the hood and look how they're actually made, they're just three components. There's three bits of colored glass: emptiness, impermanence, and suffering. That's all there is to it underneath all the vast multiplicity of forms. So when the fascination and fear begin to wane, this is nibbida, then dispassion, viraga, can arise. In the formula of the Four Noble Truths, craving or tanha is the driving engine that creates suffering, and likewise it has the same place in the dependent origination, which is really just an expansion and detail of the first and second Noble Truth. That craving or passion, desire, however you want to phrase it, that's the energy that keeps the whole thing turning around. It's the motive engine for samsara. And when that fades, that's the energy gone from the process. And it allows nirodha or cessation to occur. Samsara stops, it ceases. And then that allows vimutti, liberation, the realization of nibbana. In the practice of insight meditation, the stage in which this can occur is called equanimity about formations. This is the state that is the furthest one can go by striving. It's not yet awakening, but it's the, let's say, the launching pad or the jumping off place. And that's as far as you can go by effort or by striving. And when the mind is sitting in equanimity about formations, it's a marvelously peaceful kind of state of mind, and the meditation is flawless, but there's no sense of trying or doing or effort. It's just happening. And there's nothing more to do at that point. The process of samsara just has to wind down. It's like if you're driving in your car and you turn the engine off, but you just leave it in neutral and you don't touch the brakes. The car will continue to roll for some time just out of inertia. But it's not being given any new impulse. It'll wind down, it'll stop. Yeah. And we shouldn't be too impatient, because we've been doing this for how many billion of lifetimes. We've been chasing after this ludicrous game of samsara. So it's not so easy to stop. But we can do it. I'd also want to, for purpose of completion here, what I've been describing so far is vipassana and the vipassana path. And I would like to compare that with the other approach to the same goal, which is what we find more in the Thai tradition, which is the centering the mind in the citta. And this is also actually very close to Tibetan Dzogchen practice. It's a very similar underlying idea. This way of practice, this idea, is that it starts with this same premise that there is in any given moment consciousness and objective consciousness. And in the Burmese Vipassana approach, one focuses on the objective consciousness. And in the Thai forest approach, one centers on the knowing, the citta, and allows that to just do its thing, unobstructed. The citta in its own nature, without being complicated with all the other factors, citta in its own nature is pristinely simple. It's just the knowing. That's all there is to it. And by knowing, we've got to be clear, it's knowing in the sense of experiencing. It's not knowing in the sense of understanding. The citta doesn't really understand anything. It just experiences it. And the citta is just as it is. It can be neither purified nor defiled. It's not affected by anything. And the underlying reason for that is because it's empty. There's nothing there to be affected. You should always have a kind of caution in your mind, thinking or talking about citta, that not to be misled by the use of language. Because we say citta as a noun, it doesn't mean there's a thing that we call citta. There's just the process of chinteti, of knowing. There's nobody doing it. There's no thing doing it. It's just the knowing. Ajahn Mahabua would refer to this as your true home. Find your true home. You can't really observe the citta, because the citta is that which is doing the observing. It's like you can't see your own face. You can look in a mirror and see a reflection of your face, but that's secondhand. That's not your face. So if you think you're seeing the citta, you're just seeing an idea of the citta, or a concept of the citta. You're not seeing the citta itself. I one time attended some talks by a Tibetan Rinpoche who was talking about Dzogchen, part of his presentation, and he suggested the students try to look at the knowing mind. And let's make that the exercise. Observe the knowing mind. And I didn't think it was polite for me as a Theravada monk to challenge him publicly, but I waited till afterwards and got him aside and asked him, is it really possible to observe the knowing mind? And he kind of hemmed and hawed around a bit. Then he said, actually, no, it's not, but it's a really good exercise to try. I think that's sort of the essence of it. That also told me that they have pretty much the same understanding of the knowing mind as Thai forest tradition. But the real secret of this is that both of those two approaches, the Burmese object-oriented approach and the Thai subject-oriented approach, they both end up being the same thing when they're done well. Because if you're paying attention to the objects methodically, you have to be centered in the knowing to do that. If you go off the center, then you're identifying with the objects and you're lost. You're not doing vipassana anymore. You've gone wandering amongst the objects. And if you're centered in the knowing, like starting from the Thai position, then inevitably the objects will be clear, because that's the point from which they're observed. And either way, one sees the emptiness both ways, the knowing and the known. It's empty both sides. There's nothing to hold on to. There's nobody doing it, and there's nowhere to go. It's just as it is. So I'll stop there.